police officers stopped a woman in a parking lot, convinced she'd stolen the car, but when she reached for her ID, the truth ended his career and changed the law. Saturday afternoons in Northbrook's upscale shopping district carried a certain rhythm, designer bags swinging, sunlight glinting off polished chrome, the hum of conversations drifting from open-air cafes. That rhythm broke like glass when a sharp voice sliced through the air. "Don't bother with paperwork. I already know this car isn't yours." The words came from Officer Tom Mitchell, his hand resting just above the black snap of his holster, his eyes locked on the woman standing beside a pristine 1967 Mustang in deep ocean blue. The car's curves caught the late afternoon light like it was posing for magazine spread. The woman, Kesha Washington, wore jeans and a plain blazer, nothing flashy. Nothing that explained why such a rare piece of machinery sat purring in front of her. She didn't flinch. She didn't rush to answer. Instead, she turned slowly, and in that turn a glint caught the sun, a small metallic badge dangling from her key ring, barely larger than a quarter. It swung once, then rested, the emblem too indistinct to name from a distance, but unmistakable in its formality. Mitchell's gaze flicked toward it, then back to her face. "Step away from the vehicle," he said, louder now, a performance for whoever might be within earshot. His voice carried across the neat rows of cars and bounced off the polished glass storefronts. Two shoppers paused mid-stride. A man in a navy suit slowed, then discreetly took out his phone. Kesha's eyes moved from Mitchell to the growing cluster of curious faces. The Mustang's paint reflected them like water ripples, shapes blurring together, forming a ring. She placed the keys on the roof of the car without a word, the badge catching light again for just a heartbeat before lying still. Mitchell stepped closer, scanning her like she was a suspect on a wanted poster. "You can make this easier," he said. "Hands where I can see them. Now." The hum of the district faded as the moment thickened. Somewhere nearby, a coffee grinder whirred. The hiss of an espresso machine seemed absurdly out of place against the backdrop of tension. Kesha lifted her hands slowly, her expression unreadable, the kind of calm that wasn't submission but calculation. The Mustang idled softly, the low growl of its engine filling the silence between his words. A woman in a red dress stopped on the sidewalk watching. A teenage boy wearing earbuds pulled one out, then the other, his phone already in record mode. Mitchell adjusted his stance, one foot slightly forward, the textbook posture of control. "Do you know how much a car like this is worth?" he asked, though his tone didn't invite an answer. He looked at her as if the arithmetic was obvious. Woman plus old muscle car equals something that didn't add up. She didn't speak. The silence stretched, and in that silence the questions began forming, not just in Mitchell's mind but in the onlookers as well. Who was she, and what was that badge? Another phone appeared, this time from a man with a stroller. A couple pushing a shopping cart stopped at the edge of the lot. The circle was forming, loose at first, then slowly tightening as if drawn by gravity. Kesha's gaze moved once more to the keys on the roof, to that small piece of metal that had flashed and disappeared. It was still there, waiting like a secret that would matter later. Mitchell's fingers brushed the top of his holster again, not enough to draw, just enough to remind everyone that he could. "Ma'am," he said, voice low but hard, "I'm giving you one chance to be straight with me." The air seemed to thicken, heat radiating from the asphalt, tension coiling tighter. Somewhere behind the wall of faces, a voice whispered, "What's going on?" Another answered, "I think he's accusing her of stealing." The metallic badge on the key ring caught one last glimmer before a cloud slid over the sun. Whatever it meant, no one knew yet. But in the stillness that followed, one thing was certain: the story in this parking lot had only just begun. The buzz of weekend shopping never stopped in Northbrook, but here, in the center of the parking lot, it had shifted into something different. Conversations dipped, phones tilted upward, and somewhere near the curb, a notification sound chimed over and over. Amara Johnson, a 20-year-old communications major with a phone in her hand and an instinct for moments that mattered, had already gone live on TikTok. A camera framed Kesha beside the Mustang and Officer Mitchell standing rigid, his hands still closed to his holster. "We're live," Amara whispered more to herself than anyone else. A small banner on her screen read 273 viewers. That number blinked and jumped, 436, 821, 204. In less than a minute, comments began scrolling faster than she could read. "What's happening? Is that racial profiling? Where is this?" Mitchell's voice cut through the rising murmur. "Place your hands on the hood of the vehicle." His tone was clipped, rehearsed, the sound of a man used to giving orders without question. Kesha glanced at the Mustang's gleaming surface, then moved slowly to comply. As she leaned forward, the strap of her handbag slid down her shoulder, and the bag tipped sideways onto the asphalt. The flap popped open just enough for the edge of a dark leather case to peek out, a hard, professional briefcase corner with stitching too precise to be store-bought. The sunlight caught its metal clasp, and for a brief second, the gold-stamped corner of an official-looking seal became visible. Mitchell's eyes flicked toward it, but he didn't comment. The detail wasn't lost on Amara's lens, though it lingered in her frame, prompting a burst of curious emojis from the growing audience. "She's carrying something official," one comment read, followed by a flood of question marks. On the other side of the crowd, an older woman with silver hair and sharp, knowing eyes began pushing forward. Her name was Dorothy Hayes, though most people here didn't know it. She'd spent 40 years in courthouse corridors, watching judges rise and fall, recognizing their faces long before they sat behind the bench. Now she recognized this one. "If you knew who she was, Mrs." Hayes murmured as she reached the front line of onlookers, but before she could finish, a young man in a polo shirt put out his arm, blocking her path. "Ma'am, stay back," he said. Whether he was a concerned bystander or simply swept up in the crowd's tension didn't matter. Her words were swallowed by the noise. Mrs. Hayes tried again, louder this time. "If you knew, step back, please," another voice interrupted, and she found herself pushed sideways by the slow, relentless shift of bodies pressing in to get a better angle. The circle was tightening. Phones were higher now, held over heads, little red REC dots blinking like warning lights. Amara's viewer count jumped again, 3,452. The chat flooded with half-formed theories, accusations, demands for context. "Ask her name," someone typed. "Don't get too close, that cop looks ready." Mitchell's shadow stretched across the Mustang's hood as he stepped closer to Kesha. "This will go faster if you cooperate," he said. There was no need to say faster for whom. Kesha's eyes didn't leave his, her hands resting flat on the warm metal as if they'd been there all afternoon. The briefcase corner still peeked from her fallen bag, untouched, unnoticed by anyone who didn't know what to look for. But Mrs. Hayes noticed. She knew the weight of documents carried in leather cases like that. She'd seen the kind of people who guarded them as if they were holding the law itself. She leaned toward the man beside her and whispered, "That's not just some woman." The man raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Around them, the hum of curiosity thickened into something else, impatience. Every second Kesha stayed silent. The air seemed to press down harder. Amara's hand adjusted the angle of her phone, making sure the briefcase remained in frame. The seal had vanished from view, but the mystery of it lingered. Somewhere in the comment stream, a viewer wrote, "What's in that case?" The question hung there, unanswerable for now, but it wouldn't stay that way for long. Sun was relentless, pressing heat down onto the asphalt until the air shimmered. On the screen of Kesha Washington's phone, the time glared back at her, 10 minutes before the emergency judicial conference began. 10 minutes to be in front of a chamber where her voice would matter, and here she was with her palms flat on the hood of a Mustang while a man in uniform decided how this afternoon would unfold. Officer Mitchell's shadow shifted closer. "Registration, insurance, proof of purchase," he said, his voice clipped, as if each word was a separate command. Kesha turned her head slightly, the sunlight catching her eyes, and spoke in a tone so calm it was almost surgical. "I hope you write this report very carefully, officer, because a lot of people are watching." The words hung in the air, not raised, not shouted, but carried by a weight that made several heads in the crowd turn toward her. Mitchell's jaw tightened, somewhere behind him. Amara Johnson's livestream view counter surged 10,482. The chat feed was moving so fast now it was impossible to follow. #Northbrook stop, #what did she do, #cop watch. The hashtags began to take shape and spread, the digital version of whispers moving faster than the crowd itself. Mrs. Hayes, standing near the second row of onlookers, cupped her hands around her mouth. "Officer, listen to me," she called out. But before the rest could escape her lips, Mitchell's voice cut across hers. "Ma'am, step back, do not interfere with police business." The dismissal was sharp, final, and loud enough to draw the attention of those filming. Several cameras swung toward the older woman, catching the frustration tightening her face. Kesha glanced toward the sound of Mrs. Hayes' voice just for a second, then returned her gaze to Mitchell. Her breathing was steady, measured. She wasn't just enduring this. She was calculating. A breeze carried the faint scent of coffee from the cafe at the edge of the lot, mingling with the smell of hot pavement and idling exhaust. Somewhere in the distance, a car alarm chirped, ignored by everyone here. Mitchell shifted his weight. "You can make this simple," he said, gesturing toward her fallen bag. "Go ahead and open it." The briefcase corner was still visible, still locked in place by the fallen handbag. Kesha didn't look at it. "I'm sure you're aware," she said evenly, "that opening personal effects without cause can have consequences." The pause before the last word was deliberate. It made Mitchell blink, just once, as if the tone had forced him to check the ground beneath his feet. The crowd picked up on it, murmurs moving through the perimeter. On Amara's screen, comments multiplied. "She knows the law," one viewer wrote, followed by, "He doesn't look so sure now." The seconds ticked by, the 10-minute clock in Kesha's mind shrinking to 9, then 8. She could feel the pull of two competing forces, her duty at the courthouse and the necessity of holding this line here. "Mrs. Hayes tried again, her voice cutting through the chatter. "If you just knew," but Mitchell turned slightly, raising a hand without looking at her. "Last warning, ma'am." The heat radiating off the pavement felt heavier now, pressing down with the weight of both sun and scrutiny. Kesha let the silence breathe for a moment, letting the watching crowd lean forward in their own way, waiting for her next move. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low enough that people had to lean in, but clear enough for Amara's microphone to catch every syllable. "Everything happening here," she said, "is being documented." Mitchell's eyes narrowed. Around them, the clicks of cameras and the subtle hum of livestream audio seemed to grow louder. The circle was no longer just made of people in the parking lot. It extended to thousands beyond it, all of them waiting to see which direction this would break. The minutes were slipping away, but for the first time, it wasn't only Mitchell deciding the pace. The rising wail of sirens cut through the heavy afternoon air, and the heads of the crowd turned in unison toward the far end of the lot. Two patrol cars rolled in, tires crunching over the painted lines, their blue strobes casting flashes across the gleaming hoods of parked vehicles. Behind them, a white news van swung into position, its side emblazoned with the local channel's logo, a satellite dish already beginning to rise from its roof. The crowd swelled instinctively, bodies pressing closer until the loose half-circle around the Mustang became a nearly closed ring. Sergeant Reynolds stepped out of the first patrol car, tall and broad-shouldered, his expression shaped by 23 years of managing scenes that could either dissolve quietly or detonate without warning. He took in the sight before him, the Mustang, the woman with her hands on the hood, the officer standing tense at her side, and the wall of phones aimed like weapons. Officer Torres emerged from the second car, younger, quicker in her movements, already activating her body camera as she moved to create a perimeter. "Let's keep this orderly, folks," she called out, her voice firm but measured. She began guiding people back a step, marking a boundary line with her presence, her eyes scanning for any sign the crowd might tip into chaos. Mrs. Hayes seized the moment, her voice suddenly sharp and urgent. "That's her. She's..." But before the next word could escape, Mitchell's voice cut over hers like a slammed door. "I don't care who she is. Out here I am the law." The declaration landed like a slap, rippling through the crowd, drawing murmurs and a few audible gasps. Torres glanced toward him, a flicker of something unreadable in her expression, but she kept working, her camera silently recording every second. The side door of the news van slid open, and a reporter in a crisp blazer stepped out, followed by a cameraman hefting a shoulder rig already live streaming to the station's feed. The red tally light blinked as the lens swept the scene, pausing on Kesha's still, composed figure and the glint of the Mustang's polished chrome. In living rooms across the city, televisions were now showing this confrontation in real time, though no one here could hear the anchors in the studio narrating the tension. Mitchell straightened his stance, squaring his shoulders as if the arrival of reinforcements had only fortified his resolve. He gestured toward Kesha's fallen bag. "Open it, now." Kesha's eyes moved past him, catching sight of the news camera, then returning to meet his without flinching. "You'll want to be careful about what happens on record," she said quietly. The remark wasn't for the crowd, it was aimed squarely at him, a reminder that the lens was as much a witness as anyone standing here. Mrs. Hayes tried again, raising her voice above the noise. "You have no idea." Mitchell didn't turn to face her. "Ma'am, last warning," he barked, the clipped syllables carrying the authority of someone determined not to be undermined in front of an audience. The frustration in the crowd was starting to solidify, a collective impatience that pressed against Torres's newly drawn perimeter. People leaned forward, holding their phones high, angling to catch both the officer's unyielding stance and the woman's unshaken composure. The cameraman adjusted his focus, zooming in on Kesha's face, afternoon sun painting a thin line of light across her cheekbone. Somewhere in the crowd, Amara's phone screen reflected a surge past 20,000 live viewers, comments racing like floodwater, calling out Mitchell's arrogance, speculating about who the woman could be, urging someone to step in. The tension was a coiled wire now, humming beneath every sound, the low idle of the Mustang, the faint chatter from the news van's open door, the rustle of bodies shifting for a better view. And above it all, Mitchell's voice, clipped and unyielding, stood in stubborn defiance, unaware that the ground beneath him was already beginning to shift. The ring around the Mustang had drawn tight, shoulder to shoulder now, a living wall of strangers holding up their phones. Beyond them, tens of thousands were watching through tiny glowing screens, the sound of the parking lot carried into living rooms and dorm rooms, offices and coffee shops. The air felt heavier, not just from the late afternoon heat, but from the weight of anticipation. Every breath, every twitch of movement seemed to matter. Kesha shifted her stance, a voice calm but clear. "Officer, with your permission, I'd like to reach for my identification." The request was deliberate, each word measured. She didn't look away from him, but she knew the cameras would catch the moment. Mitchell hesitated, his jaw locked tight. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he said, but the command landed weaker than before. She inclined her head slightly, a gesture of acknowledgement, then spoke again. "You can watch my hands the entire time. You can follow your procedure, but this ends here." There was something in the way she said it that made even the nearest onlookers lean forward. Her right hand moved slowly toward the fallen handbag. Every muscle in her arm worked with controlled precision, the way someone trained to avoid escalation might move. The moment stretched, the crowd holding its collective breath. The sound of a single car door slamming somewhere in the distance seemed unnaturally loud. She knelt, fingers brushing the leather, and lifted the bag so the sunlight fell directly on it. Then, instead of reaching into the open top, she slid her hand into the side pocket and drew out a black leather portfolio. The cameras caught everything, the polished surface, the embossed seal faintly glimmering along its edge. Kesha held it chest-high, not opening it yet, letting the anticipation sharpen. Mitchell's stance shifted, one foot scraping the asphalt. Around them, the murmurs rose and fell like waves. For full 3 seconds she didn't move. She let the stillness become a stage, her audience, both here and online, leaning into the moment. Then she opened the portfolio with a soft snap that carried farther than it should have. Inside, against cream-colored documents, sat an official identification card. The seal of the Superior Court of California caught the light. Beneath it, in precise print, Judge Kesha Washington, Superior Court. Criminal Division. The effect was immediate. Gasps broke from the crowd. A low exclamation of "Oh my God" came from somewhere behind Amara's phone, her live-stream chat exploding with capital letters and fire emojis. Mitchell's face changed in a way no training could mask, the rigid confidence draining out, replaced by the pale realization of what he was seeing. Kesha looked directly at him, her voice steady, her words cutting through the stunned silence. "Officer, you've just attempted to detain the very person you will one day stand before to give testimony." The sentence hit like a hammer. A ripple of sound moved through the bystanders, shocked laughter, whispered curses, someone muttering, "He's finished." Mitchell's eyes darted from the ID to her face, as if searching for some angle that would undo what had just happened. There was none. The cameraman from the news station stepped in closer, the red tally light burning bright as the lens zoomed in on the card. Then back to her expression, controlled, unwavering. She closed the portfolio with the same deliberate care she had opened it, the gesture punctuating the reversal of control. "This is not just about me," she continued, her gaze still fixed on Mitchell. "It's about the assumptions you carried into this moment and the authority you chose to wield without cause." The crowd was electric now, phones high, recording from every angle, on Amara's feed. The comments were moving so fast they blurred into a single stream, people tagging friends, posting clips already ripped from the live broadcast. Somewhere in the middle of that, a viewer typed the question everyone was suddenly thinking: what happens to him now? The silence between them was no longer the silence of intimidation. It was the silence of a man realizing the ground beneath him had shifted completely. Mitchell's grip on his belt loosened. His voice, when it came, lacked the edge it had held minutes ago. "Judge, but he didn't finish." She had no need to push further in that moment. The power had already changed hands, and the story that would follow had just found its turning point. The air in the parking lot had shifted. Moments ago, Mitchell had owned the space with his stance and his tone. Now, every eye was on Kesha Washington, and the weight of that collective gaze had turned toward him. She held the portfolio at her side like it was nothing more than an accessory, but her voice carried the precision of a courtroom. "Officer Mitchell," she began, the syllables crisp. "California Penal Code Section 135 prohibits discrimination by law enforcement based on race, color, or national origin. Under Federal Statute 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, such actions constitute a civil rights violation." The words landed flat and heavy, factual rather than emotional, and for that reason they struck deeper. Around them, the murmurs grew louder. A few people in the crowd nodded as if recognizing the code numbers from headlines. Mitchell's eyes darted once to Sergeant Reynolds, but Reynolds didn't move. The sergeant's face was unreadable, his gaze fixed on the ground between them. Kesha stepped closer to the Mustang, keeping her movements measured. "Your department's stop rate for black drivers," she continued, "is 23% higher than the county average. And your personal record includes 18 excessive force complaints and 2 federal lawsuits settled quietly by the city." A bead of sweat slid from Mitchell's temple, cutting a quick path down his cheek. He swallowed hard but didn't speak. Amara's phone caught the moment perfectly, the chat section erupting with disbelief and outrage. The news cameraman zoomed in tighter, capturing every twitch of Mitchell's jaw. Then Kesha added, her tone still calm but sharpened by something colder, "Do you know what I was supposed to be doing 10 minutes ago?" Mitchell said nothing. "Attending an emergency judicial conference to break a tie vote on a landmark police accountability measure," she said. She let the pause stretch, allowing the words to sink in before delivering the twist. "And that conference was also voting on case number 2024 CR 8847. Your case, Officer Mitchell, your federal civil rights lawsuit." The reaction was immediate, a collective gasp from the crowd, followed by a rush of whispers and the frantic tapping of thumbs on phone screens as the information ricocheted online. Mitchell's composure cracked further, his lips parted as though he might respond, but no words came. Kesha didn't let him recover. "The plaintiff, Angela Rodriguez, alleges you profiled her during a traffic stop right here in Northbrook Shopping District. 18 months ago, same assumptions, same pattern of behavior. Today, you've given this county another example to add to that record." Mitchell's gaze dropped to the asphalt. His shoulders, once squared, now seemed to sag beneath the weight of her words. The blue lights from the patrol cars pulsed against the side of his face, highlighting the sheen of sweat along his brow. The livestream view count on Amara's phone surged past 50,000. The chat was a blur of exclamation marks, demands for his firing, and disbelief at the coincidence. But it wasn't coincidence, and everyone knew it now. Kesha's voice softened slightly, not with sympathy, but with the quiet authority of someone used to closing arguments. "Your actions here today will be documented alongside your prior conduct. And unlike in your previous encounters, the evidence is undeniable. Multiple live recordings, independent media coverage, body camera footage, my own contemporaneous record." She lifted her phone briefly, showing the still recording screen. Every frame, every word preserved. The cameraman caught Mitchell shifting his stance again, his boots scuffing the pavement. His eyes flicked toward the crowd, scanning the faces, perhaps hoping to find one person who might still see him as the man in control. He found none. The power dynamic had not only shifted, it had inverted. Kesha let the silence sit for a few beats before delivering the final thrust. "Officer Mitchell, this moment will follow you into every hearing, every review board, every conversation about whether you should carry a badge, and I assure you, I will be present for those conversations." She didn't need to raise her voice. The steadiness was more damning than any shout could be. Mitchell's breathing had grown heavier, each inhale visible in the rise of his chest. The man who had walked into this parking lot certain of his authority was now standing in front of the very person with the power to decide the fate of his career. The twist wasn't just that she was a judge, it was that she was his judge, and everyone watching knew it. The crowd had gone still, the only sounds the faint hum of idling engines and the occasional click of a phone camera. Television lenses stayed locked on Kesha Washington, and thousands more watched through live streams that captured every detail in high definition. The power had shifted completely, and now she stood with the portfolio in one hand, her voice carrying with the kind of calm that made people lean in to listen. "Officer Mitchell, you have 3 options," she said. "Option 1, immediate suspension pending a federal investigation under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983, with possible criminal charges, civil liability, and permanent termination. Option 2, voluntary demotion, completion of 200 hours of bias training, and testimony before the state legislature on the dangers of racial profiling, becoming an advocate for change. Option 3. Immediate retirement with full benefits. Acknowledging that your approach to policing has no place in the future of this department. Her words were deliberate, her tone without malice but heavy with authority. You have 60 seconds to decide. The choice will be binding. The crowd stirred, a low ripple of murmurs passing from person to person. Phones stayed steady in the air, the small red recording lights fixed on both of them. Amara Johnson glanced at her phone screen, where comments scrolled faster than she could read. He's going to retire. No, he'll take the training. He won't risk jail. She read some of them out loud in a hushed voice, and the people near her leaned in to hear, adding their own whispered predictions to the mix. Kesha didn't look at the crowd, her eyes never left Mitchell. 50 seconds, she said, the words measured, not rushed. Mitchell's breathing was audible now, shallow and uneven. The blue lights from the patrol cars pulsed across his face, alternating between shadow and glare. 40 seconds. He shifted his weight, glanced briefly at Sergeant Reynolds, but Reynolds remained still, his expression neutral. 30 seconds. The murmurs in the crowd swelled, some encouraging him to take the second option, others demanding suspension. Mitchell wiped at his forehead, the movement stiff, his hand trembling slightly. 20 seconds. A woman near the front clasped her hands as if watching a verdict being read. Amara's viewer count spiked again, 80,000 now, and climbing. People around the country were leaning toward their screens, waiting for this officer's decision in real time. 10 seconds, Kesha said, her tone sharpening just enough to cut through the whispers. Officer, this decision will be remembered by hundreds of thousands of people. It will follow you longer than any case you've ever worked. Choose wisely. Mitchell looked down at the handcuffs still clipped to his belt, the same cuffs he had been ready to use on her not long ago. He closed his eyes for a brief second, then lifted his head. I choose option 2, he said, his voice barely above a murmur but clear enough for the microphones to catch. I'll accept the demotion, complete the training, and testify. The tension in the air broke in an instant. A wave of voices erupted from the crowd, some surprised, some relieved, a few even applauding. On Amara's live stream, the comments exploded. He actually took it. This is history. Accountability live on camera. Kesha gave a small nod, the kind reserved for defendants who took responsibility. Then it begins now, she said. There was no triumph in her voice, only certainty. Mitchell's head lowered slightly, the weight of what he had agreed to settling in. The cameras kept rolling, capturing the moment an officer chose reform over resistance. And for the first time that afternoon, the crowd felt the shift from confrontation towards something else, change. 6 months later, the parking lot confrontation was no longer just a memory. It was a case study taught in police academies, law schools, and community leadership seminars. Senate Bill 1619, the Police Accountability and Community Trust Act, had passed with a decisive majority. It mandated body cameras for all traffic stops, quarterly bias training, and the creation of civilian oversight boards with real authority. Across the state, departments scrambled to meet the deadlines, and other states began drafting similar bills. In classrooms for new recruits, instructors queued up the footage from that afternoon in Northbrook. They paused on Mitchell's tense face, on Kesha's steady gaze, on the exact moment he chose option 2. It was no longer just an incident, it was a turning point. Mitchell completed his 200 hours of bias training. His testimony before the state legislature was raw, candid, and replayed in news segments for weeks. I saw a black woman with an expensive car and assumed criminality, he told lawmakers. I nearly ended my career and violated the constitutional rights of a judge because of prejudices I didn't know I carried. His words became part of the training script, a reminder that accountability could start with one admission. Mrs. Dorothy Hayes, whose voice had been nearly silenced that day, now chaired the county's first civilian police oversight board. Her decades of courthouse experience shaped policies, reviewed misconduct cases, and mentored younger members. We can't erase prejudice, she often said in interviews, but we can refuse to ignore it. Amara Johnson, once a college student holding up a phone in the heat of the moment, graduated with a degree in journalism and joined a major network as a civil rights correspondent. Her footage from the Mustang standoff earned awards and invitations to speak at media conferences about the role of citizen reporting in democracy. And Kesha Washington still drove the same 1967 Mustang. Every Saturday morning, rain or shine, she eased it into her reserved spot outside the courthouse. The chrome still caught the light. The paint still gleamed, But now it was more than her father's car. It was a symbol recognized far beyond the city. One quiet Saturday, Mrs. Hayes was waiting by the courthouse steps. Kesha parked, stepped out, and for a moment they simply regarded each other with the mutual understanding of two women who had stood on the same side of history. "You kept it spotless," Mrs. Hayes said, nodding toward the car. Kesha smiled. "Some things deserve to be preserved." Then her expression grew thoughtful. "Justice should be driven by truth, not by prejudice." Mrs. Hayes held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. Around them the city moved as it always had, people rushing to work, buses groaning at stops, conversations spilling from cafe doors, but the system they served was different now. The laws had changed. The training had changed. And in ways both visible and unseen, the trust between the community and those sworn to protect it had begun to rebuild. The story of that Saturday afternoon lived on, not as a tale of humiliation or vengeance, but as proof that one confrontation, when met with discipline and courage, could ripple outward to reshape an entire system. For those who had watched it unfold live, for those who studied it in classrooms, and for those who simply heard it retold, the lesson was clear: when power meets truth, the course of justice can change forever. If you enjoyed this story, let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories.